Hey y'all, it's me, Kevvie. So it's been a couple months since my first Agatha Christie video, so I figured I'd do a part 2 to share the books I've read since then. As usual, I will remain mostly spoiler-free, but if I do go into spoiler territory, I will give you a heads up and a time code to jump to. Right when I started reading Cards on the Table, I read a spoiler for another book, but it didn't specify which book it was. I was really worried at first that the spoiler was for the book I was reading, but as I read on, I grew less and less concerned. They established early on that only these 4 characters could have possibly done it. But then how could a solution where any of them is the killer be satisfactory? Wasn't my favorite, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. One thing I really liked about this book was that it brought 4 of Christie's detectives together. Hercule Poirot, Ariadne Oliver, Colonel Race, and Superintendent Battle. All of them had to work together on this case, but it was first and foremost a Poirot story. I had previously read Colonel Race's introduction in Man in the Brown Suit, but this was my first encounter with Superintendent Battle and Ariadne Oliver. I really enjoyed all of them, except maybe Colonel Race. I appreciate how each of them was written so differently. I'm glad to have met more recurring characters from the Christie canon, and I'm excited to read more of them. Five Little Pigs was the first Agatha Christie story I read where Poirot deals with a retrospective murder. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to work. How could he solve anything if he wasn't there? But I should have never doubted our great Belgian detective. I was quite satisfied with it. Some say this book is slow and repetitive because you hear the same story over and over and over from different perspectives. I didn't mind that. Each time we heard a new perspective, there were new things we learned from it. I was never able to figure out who did this. Couldn't even begin to place my finger on anybody. This case really did seem to me unsolvable until Poirot strung it all together at the end. Spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. As I was reading, I thought to myself that I could really see any of them doing it except one. At the time, there seemed absolutely no motive for that one to do it. This character would only benefit if the victim were still alive. I love that Christie was able to know what I was thinking and subvert my expectations by suddenly revealing the true motive, and suddenly there was only one person who could have actually done it. I have very little positive to say about the clocks. It had a couple of funny moments, and while the title wasn't a nursery rhyme, there was one included in the story, one of my favorites, The Walrus and the Carpenter. I know a lot of people feel contempt for Christie's reliance on nursery rhymes for her plots, but I find it charming. You gotta get a gimmick, and I love the idea of taking an innocent children's nursery rhyme and turning it into a nefarious murder plot. It works in some cases, like And Then There Were None, but here it wasn't central to the plot, merely a clue that Poirot gives to the narrator. I also liked the concept that the crime that is so complicated must be quite simple, although frankly it wasn't simple at all. Poirot is terrible in this book. He enters the story quite late, like Miss Marple level late. He isn't even mentioned until chapter 11, and then we don't see him proper until chapter 14. And then we only see him in 3 chapters. Poirot is challenged to solve this case without leaving his office. In premise, that's pretty cool, but in execution, it did not work. Poirot, as he does, refuses to say who he thinks it is when he's first figured it out. Spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So while he was sitting on his answer, he allowed someone to get murdered. Then later, when it's time to reveal whodunit, Poirot tricks the narrator, and Poirot has the gall to say, I thought of cutting my finger and putting a blood-stained fingerprint on the door. He treats this whole thing like it's a fucking game, when actual lives are in danger and somebody died. You can tell at this point that Christie has a real contempt for her character, so she's making him worse and worse. This was the first time that Agatha Christie had me raging. I literally had to get up and walk away. Spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Early in the story, the detective goes to the stenographer's aunt's house, where he learned that Sheila's parents aren't dead. The father just ran out on the mother, so the mom gave her daughter to her sister. We also learn that the mother was a teacher. We know the blind woman, Mrs. Pebmarsh, is a teacher. So you start to put together that perhaps Mrs. Pebmarsh is Sheila's mother. Then I went a step further. What if the victim was Sheila's father? As I read, more and more clues seemed to fit this theory. They mentioned that the dead man had a scar behind his left ear, and when Pebmarsh was trying to identify the body, she spent a long time feeling at the left ear, suggesting that she recognized it. While I still had no idea who killed the man, I was fairly confident, at least, in this family dynamic. Then it came time to reveal who done it. They reveal a couple of things I hadn't picked up on. Then they go on to say that the victim wasn't Sheila's dad, but some random-ass dude from Canada. Why did they make such a big deal out of the ear clue if it didn't even fucking matter? This random man was connected to one of the neighbors in this simple crime that was really convoluted and stupid. And whether or not Pebmarsh and Sheila were even related didn't come up in Poirot's Big Finish. In the final chapter, they do go on to kind of confirm it, but it pisses me off too. So we're supposed to just accept that the murderer knew Pebmarsh and Sheila were related and wanted to pin it on them, or is it just some cosmic coincidence? It's never explained. The fact that the corpse was not the father and that the family relationship was irrelevant to the solution enrages me. Christie sure surprised me with this ending, but not in a way I enjoyed. I had real high hopes for Three Blind Mice. It contains two of my favorite tropes, snowed in and the isolated closed circle. It was adapted into the stage play The Mousetrap, which is the longest running play in history. It first opened in the 1950s with the stipulation in its contract that no film could ever be produced until at least 6 months after the initial run had closed. Then it never closed. Well, at least not until everything shut down, if you know what I mean. I don't know if this can count as a loophole, and now we can get a movie, but I sure hope so. Anyway, this short story had a lot going for it, but I was really disappointed. She was very heavy-handed in establishing which characters we were or were not supposed to suspect. When the reveal happened, it didn't feel earned. Spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Like I said, this story was so obvious. First, there was a gay character, so obviously we're supposed to suspect him, and she worked hard to make him unlikable. But as soon as we learned the phone line was cut, I knew that the call Molly received from the police couldn't have actually been from the police. And so this detective was not who he said he was. And then once they're snowed in, the only character we know has been outside is the detective, because he arrived during the storm. It was most likely that the man cut the wires before even making himself known to the house. The thing that bothered me most, however, was that right before the big reveal, Molly acquired a huge piece of evidence. The mysterious foreigner had lied about what he was doing when the murder took place. They had established that whoever lied during this exercise had to be the murderer. So even though I had been suspecting the detective from the get-go, I was ready to accept that it was the foreigner. But as soon as she got this evidence, they revealed it was the detective. It was sudden and frustrating because we just received what was supposed to be significant evidence, then it turned out to be irrelevant. I feel like this story's main issue was its pacing. The backstory with the kids was glossed over, and the ending was so rushed. It ruined the immersion. I would suggest that this was the result of being a short story and trying to fit everything as tight as you can. But I've read Witness for the Prosecution, so I know Christie can handle a good short story. Overall, I didn't like this one, but it didn't send me into a rage like The Clocks. Ordeal by Innocence was my first buddy read. I read it with Naomi from Naomi's bookshelf. Every day we'd read 6 chapters, and then at night we would discuss with each other our thoughts and suspicions. Doing this buddy read was a great experience for me, and I definitely want to do more. In Ordeal by Innocence, a man is convicted of murdering his adopted mother 2 years ago, and has since died in prison. And then a man shows up out of the blue, providing the deceased with a perfect alibi. Naomi told me never to trust a perfect alibi. The title comes from the idea that if they never figure out who the killer is, the whole family will forever be suspected, and that will be forever looming over every innocent family member for the rest of their life. This gives our protagonist the motivation to try to solve the case. I really enjoyed this one. Some of the middle chapters didn't feel like they were contributing much, but it had a strong beginning and a strong ending. Peril at End House is without a doubt my favorite of this video. Easily in my top 3 Agatha Christie novels so far. It's about a girl named Nick who, over the past few days, has experienced several almost fatal accidents. He convinces her to invite a cousin to come stay with her to protect her from danger, but of course it backfires. I really loved the character of Nick. Apart from Mrs. Bantry in Body in the Library, this may be my new favorite Agatha Christie character. I loved her whimsy and joie de vivre. She's a woman with many secrets, and until we know what those secrets are, we'll never know who is behind all these attempts on her life. Spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The moment Nick says she'll invite Maggie, I knew that Maggie was either going to be the killer or the victim. Right about halfway through the book, I thought, what if Maggie was the intended victim all along, and that the killer was actually Nick? As much as I hoped this would be the case, I really didn't think it was likely. Poirot had written a list of suspects, labeled A through J. J was left blank, meant to be someone he hadn't considered. But then the final chapter was called K, meaning they added someone new to the bottom of the list. And at that moment I knew I was right. It was Nick. Oh, I was so thrilled about this outcome, because all along I'd really hoped it would be her. Halloween Party was a bleak read. This is the youngest murder victim I've read about so far in an Agatha Christie novel, being a girl of only 13 years old. She claims to have witnessed a murder and is then killed because of it. This story was fun because not only is Poirot investigating the murder of this child, but several other deaths that have occurred over the past few years in this town, trying to identify which one she could have witnessed. But if everybody in town says that she's a rotten liar, did she even witness a murder at all? But if not, why was she killed? Really enjoyed watching how this one played out. Halloween Party also saw the return of Ariadne Oliver. I really like her. In the future, I'm definitely planning to seek out more books with her. Her character is a delight and an excellent counter to Poirot throughout the investigation. Originally, I was planning to end this video after 7 books, but after Halloween was sort of middle of the road, I decided I wanted to end on a high and picked out Poirot Investigates. I did not like this book. Yeah, my expectations were high, but I thought most of the stories were only average at best. The only 2 I really liked were The Hunter's Lodge and The Chocolate Box. I loved both of those stories. If the rest of them were on the same level, this would have been an excellent book. What really brought this book down were the first and final stories. They shared a theme of racism against Asians. Apparently, this was a very common trope of mystery novels in the early 20s, so much so that when the 10 Commandments of mystery writing were established, one of them explicitly stated no Asian characters, in an attempt to curb this racist tendency. I can understand a book being of its time, but in these 2 Agatha Christie short stories, the racism is a central part of the plot, with the solutions revolving around harmful Asian stereotypes. These stories were really uncomfortable to read and really brought down my enjoyment of this book. If you're a fan of short stories, you may enjoy this book, but I'd suggest not reading it straight through, and instead just reading the ones that sound interesting to you. I definitely recommend Hunter's Lodge and Chocolate Box, as well as The Missing Will, Marsden Manor, The Veiled Lady, and The $1 Million Bond Robbery. Here is my updated Agatha Christie ranking. On the left is just the books I've read and discussed in this video. And on the right, I've put them in context with the books that I've read previously. You'll see that from this batch there were a couple I really liked, but most of them wound up middle of the pack or at the very bottom. I'm hoping that my next batch of Agatha Christie reads will be better. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you have a good recommendation, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if it pleases and sparkles, I'll see you in the next video. Mwah!